Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. The moment you can't be controlled is the moment you become a problem. That sentence alone explains why this topic exists and why it makes certain people deeply uncomfortable. Because what was uncovered about you wasn't loud, dramatic, or supernatural. It was far more unsettling than that. It was verifiable. Patterns don't lie, behavior doesn't lie. And when someone consistently doesn't react the way the system expects, alarms start ringing quietly in places you'll never see. Here's a fact most people never talk about. Studies in behavioral psychology show that groups become anxious, not when someone rebels, but when someone cannot be predicted. Rebels can be managed. Predictable people can be steered. But individuals who think independently, detach emotionally, and move based on internal logic instead of social pressure, those individuals trigger instability. Not because they attack the system, but because they expose it. That's where you come in. At first, you were misread, then underestimated, then dismissed. But slowly, something didn't add up. You didn't burn out when expected. You didn't beg for approval. You didn't collapse under pressure. And most confusing of all, you didn't need an audience. That's when the shift happened. Curiosity turned into concern. Confidence turned into agitation. And what looked like calm observation on your part started feeling like silent exposure on theirs. Now let's add a tiny bit of humor before this gets too intense, because nothing rattles fragile control more than someone who's serious and unbothered. You didn't flip tables. You didn't announce your awakening. You just kept functioning better. Which, oddly enough, is far more irritating than rebellion. It's like losing a chess game to someone who never trash-talked, never celebrated, and quietly put the king in checkmate while sipping water. This isn't about ego. It's not about being special. It's about the uncomfortable truth that when someone stops needing external permission to think, move, and recover, others start losing their grip. And once that truth surfaced about you, it couldn't be unseen. That's the truth they uncovered, and that's why the composure cracked. Number one, you don't absorb group conditioning the way others do. Most people don't realize how much of their thinking isn't actually theirs. Opinions arrive prepackaged, reactions are socially approved, and fear is often borrowed from the room rather than felt internally. You operate differently. When a crowd panics, you pause. When a trend demands loyalty, you hesitate. Not because you're stubborn, but because your mind doesn't automatically download group emotion as truth. That alone sets you apart more than any label ever could. What was uncovered is that pressure doesn't stick to you the same way. Guilt, urgency, outrage, excitement, these things pass through you instead of settling in. You observe them, weigh them, and then decide. That delay is small, but it's everything. Systems depend on instant emotional compliance. Advertising, authority, social circles, even families rely on the assumption that most people will feel first and think later. You break that assumption without trying. This isn't about intelligence in the traditional sense, it's about internal independence. You don't need the room to agree before you're comfortable disagreeing. You don't rush to align just to avoid discomfort, and because of that, fear tactics fail faster on you. Once fear doesn't work, control weakens. That's when discomfort begins on the other side. People around you may not even know why they feel uneasy. They sense that you're present, but not programmable. You listen, but you're not absorbent. You participate, but you're not owned. That creates a strange tension, because group dynamics depend on emotional syncing. When one person doesn't sync, the rhythm stumbles. What really unsettles others is that you don't announce this difference. You're not dramatic about it. You don't need to prove anything. You simply don't react on cue. And over time, that reveals something most people don't want to confront. That much of their certainty is inherited, not chosen. This is why attempts to pressure you often escalate. When subtle influence fails, people try volume. When volume fails, they try urgency. When urgency fails, frustration sets in. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're not doing what's expected. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. You are harder to steer because your inner compass isn't calibrated by the crowd. Once that became clear, it exposed how fragile group control really is. And that realization is what started to shake them. Number 2, you notice incentives, not stories. Most people get swept up in narratives. They see a story and automatically assign meaning to it, reacting as though the plotline itself dictates reality. They argue, debate, and fight over versions of events, convinced that the story shapes the world. You don't. You see the story for what it is: a wrapper, a disguise, a convenient packaging for someone else's agenda. What catches your attention is what drives the story: who benefits, who loses, and why. That shift in focus is what sets you apart, and it's deeply disorienting for others. When people realized this about you, it became obvious quickly. You don't respond to dramatics, hype, or carefully curated narratives. You look behind the curtain, track the movement of incentives, and understand the mechanics underneath. A speech designed to impress doesn't move you. A viral outrage doesn't trigger you. A seemingly spontaneous action is immediately analyzed in terms of the advantages it brings to someone. That's why your reactions, or lack thereof, confuse and irritate others. You're not being cynical, you're being accurate. The consequence of this perspective is twofold. First, it makes manipulation nearly impossible. People can't fool you with stories because you're not invested in them emotionally. Second, it exposes the truth behind actions. You spot inconsistencies, hidden motives and patterns that remain invisible to those lost in narrative thinking. Once this became obvious, it made certain individuals panic internally. They were accustomed to people reacting predictably to stories, and when you didn't, it challenged their perception of control. It's not just about seeing through lies. It's about understanding cause and effect at a level most people never notice. You watch the incentives shift, notice who gains power, and respond strategically. And the quiet realization that you operate this way unsettles them more than any argument ever could. They can tell you're seeing more. They can sense that you understand the machinery behind appearances. That awareness doesn't just make them frustrated, it shakes their confidence, because it proves that much of their influence is only surface deep, and they can no longer trust it to work on you. Number 3. You recover faster than expected from setbacks. People expected your difficult moments to slow you down permanently. They assumed disappointment would harden you, failure would shrink you, and loss would leave a lasting mark that defined your limits. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and that's where the discomfort began. You don't stay broken as long as people predict. You don't spiral endlessly. You process, adjust, and move forward with a speed that doesn't match the damage you took. What makes this unsettling is not that you avoid pain. You feel it fully. You just don't let it become your identity. While others replay what happened over and over, you extract what matters and let the rest go. You don't glamorize suffering, but you don't waste it either. You treat setbacks like information, not life sentences. That alone changes the trajectory of everything you touch. This recovery pattern confuses people because it breaks a common expectation, that pain should weaken you visibly and for a long time. When it doesn't, it forces others to question their own coping mechanisms. Some people survive by clinging to their wounds. Others build entire personalities around what went wrong. You don't. You refuse to stay emotionally parked in places that no longer serve you, and that refusal feels threatening to those who do. There's also something quietly disciplined about how you bounce back. You don't announce growth, You don't perform healing for sympathy. You simply stabilize, recalibrate, and continue. That makes it harder for others to predict you, and unpredictability creates unease. When someone can't measure your damage, they can't use it. What was uncovered is that your strength isn't loud resilience, it's efficient resilience. You don't need years to recover from moments that would derail others. That doesn't mean you're untouched. It means you're adaptive. And adaptation is far more powerful than toughness. This is why attempts to discourage you tend to backfire. What was meant to slow you down ends up sharpening you. Over time, people notice the pattern. They see that you fall, get quiet, then come back clearer, steadier, and harder to shake. That realization disrupts expectations and unsettles anyone who assumed your breaking point would be permanent. Number 4. You don't seek validation where it's offered. Most people are trained to crave approval. Compliments, likes, recognition, and social reinforcement act like a reward system. The more you chase it, the more predictable and controllable you become. You, however, operate differently. You don't rely on external signals to feel legitimate or capable. You measure your progress internally, and that detachment from social approval is what unnerves others the most. When people realized this about you, it created an invisible tension. They tried the usual levers: praise, influence, persuasion, subtle flattery, and even social pressure. None of it landed the way they expected. You weren't motivated by the applause or the nods. You weren't negotiating your actions based on who was watching. That lack of responsiveness made people uncomfortable because it exposed a fundamental truth they rarely face. Much of their influence depends entirely on your need to be noticed. The quiet power in this is undeniable. You don't need to justify your choices to anyone. You don't inflate your identity to satisfy the expectations of a room. And you don't shrink or adjust yourself to earn affection or approval. That independence is destabilizing for those who trade in validation as currency, because it proves that authority and social hierarchy are illusions when someone stops participating in them voluntarily. It's not arrogance, it's precision. You only respond to what aligns with your principles, goals, or understanding of reality, not what will make others comfortable or impressed. You aren't performing, you're functioning, and that distinction cuts deeper than confrontation ever could. Over time, your indifference to external validation starts to reshape interactions around you. People begin to second-guess their influence. They notice that coercion, manipulation, and even persuasion are failing more often than not. That makes them uneasy, anxious, and sometimes even irrational. The truth uncovered here is simple but powerful. When you refuse to seek approval where it's offered, you remove one of the primary tools of control that society depends on. And that realization, that your allegiance is to yourself, not to the applause, sends ripples of instability through anyone who assumed otherwise. Number 5. You think in second-order consequences. Most people react to what's immediately in front of them. They see an event, hear a statement, or witness a decision, and their response is rooted in the moment. You operate differently. You instinctively calculate what happens next and what happens after that. You track the ripple effects of actions, words, and choices, often before others even notice them. That ability makes you almost impossible to predict and deeply unnerving to those who rely on surface-level reactions to maintain control. When people realized this about you, they started to panic quietly. They expected a standard, reactive approach, something simple to anticipate and influence. Instead, they encountered foresight. You don't just see what's happening. You understand how it will unfold, who will benefit, and who will lose. You don't get caught up in the drama of now because you're already observing the mechanics of the aftermath. That level of perception isn't loud or obvious, but it destabilizes those who depend on short-term manipulation. This skill doesn't just give you clarity, It gives you leverage. You notice consequences that others ignore because they're too focused on immediate gratification or social approval. You anticipate the fallout from decisions, the hidden costs of actions, and the subtle ways influence travels through people. That foresight allows you to act strategically, avoid pitfalls, and navigate complex situations with an ease that appears almost effortless. What truly unsettles others is that you rarely have to explain your reasoning. You don't need validation for your foresight. You make decisions quietly, based on a deep understanding of cause and effect, and let the results speak for themselves. That creates a quiet but powerful tension. People sense that you understand the long game, and they feel exposed because their moves, designed to control or impress, are no longer as effective. The truth uncovered is stark. While others are trapped in immediate reactions, you live in the realm of consequences. That awareness doesn't just give you power, it reveals the fragility of those around you, showing them that most of what they depend on for influence is temporary, shallow, and easily anticipated by someone who refuses to play the short-term game. Number 6. You can walk away without needing closure. Most people are tethered to situations, relationships, or conflicts because they feel the need for resolution. They chase explanations, demand apologies, or linger on what went wrong, believing that without closure, they remain incomplete. You don't operate that way. You can step away from circumstances, conversations, or people without seeking validation, explanation, or emotional reconciliation. That ability is rare, and it's quietly terrifying to those who depend on predictability and emotional leverage. When others realize this about you, it created an invisible tension. They expected that disputes, tension, or unfinished business would anchor you, make you vulnerable, or force engagement. Instead, you removed yourself effortlessly, leaving the situation intact but subtly shifted. Your departure doesn't escalate drama, but it also doesn't grant them the satisfaction of control. That absence, this refusal to be emotionally cornered, is far more disarming than confrontation ever could be. This is not indifference. You don't ignore what matters. You simply refuse to let unresolved issues dictate your energy or define your behavior. You understand that some things are beyond your influence, and that the pursuit of closure is often a trap designed to tether attention, obedience, or emotion. By walking away, you preserve your autonomy and deny others the psychological foothold they often assume is theirs. What unsettles people most is that you don't announce this skill. You don't parade your independence. You act, and the shift is felt rather than loudly demonstrated. They sense that you aren't bound by expectations, obligations, or social pressure. They realize that their usual levers, guilt, persuasion, threats, or even appeals to morality, simply won't work on you. The truth uncovered is simple but disruptive. You can disengage from situations cleanly without needing the reassurance of a tidy ending. That ability exposes how much influence relies on emotional dependence. It shows others that control is an illusion when someone can operate without needing to tie up every thread. And that realization, silent as it may be, is what begins to unravel their assumptions about you and, ultimately, about themselves. Number 7. You're not impressed by confidence, only consistency. Most people are dazzled by appearances. A loud voice, a polished image, or bold claims can create the illusion of power, intelligence, or authority. Confidence is often mistaken for competence, and that illusion is deeply comforting to those who prefer simplicity over scrutiny. You operate differently. You don't get caught up in the performance. You don't hand out respect based on charisma alone. What matters to you is consistency, actions aligning with words, repeated reliability, and measurable follow-through. That perspective is quietly revolutionary, and it disorients people who built influence on theatricality. When others realized this about you, it created subtle panic. They were used to performing for approval, relying on the facade of confidence to steer reactions, and manipulating perception through controlled displays. You don't reward those illusions. You observe results, not posturing. That gap between appearance and reality exposes weaknesses that others assumed were invisible. Your disregard for charm or bravado highlights inconsistencies, and it subtly forces people to confront the difference between showmanship and substance. This isn't cynicism, it's precision. You value truth in action over spectacle in speech. You track patterns over promises. You notice when someone consistently delivers and when they falter, and your recognition isn't swayed by noise, drama, or forced enthusiasm. That attention to reality, rather than performance, quietly shifts the balance of perception. People who rely on flair and persuasion suddenly find their influence reduced because their usual tactics fail in the face of your measured scrutiny. The tension you create doesn't need to be loud or confrontational. It's in the way you evaluate, in the way you respond, or don't respond, to displays of power. It's in the subtle but undeniable fact that what dazzles the crowd doesn't impress you. Over time, this exposes the hollow center of confidence built without consistency and forces others to recalibrate their strategies. The truth uncovered is sharp. People overestimate their own authority when they rely on confidence alone. Once it became clear that you value consistency above all else, it quietly destabilized their assumptions, revealing that much of what they depend on to influence others is fragile and easily ignored by someone who pays attention to results, not show. Number 8. You don't confuse being busy with being effective. Most people wear busyness like a badge of honor. Meetings, endless notifications, constant motion. It all creates the illusion of progress. To them, exhaustion is proof of importance, and activity is mistaken for achievement. You operate on a different frequency. You measure output, results, and meaningful impact. Movement for the sake of movement doesn't impress you, and that makes you quietly disruptive to anyone who built their sense of worth on appearances of effort. When people realized this about you, it created an internal friction they couldn't explain. They assumed that by keeping up a constant pace, showing urgency, and demonstrating visible effort, they were ahead, untouchable, or in control. You saw past it. You identify what matters, cut through distractions, and direct energy where it counts. That refusal to glorify motion exposes inefficiency, laziness disguised as work, and the fragile egos of those who need to appear busy to feel significant. This distinction isn't arrogance. It's precision and clarity. You don't waste time on performative tasks or public displays of diligence. You focus on outcomes, not optics. That approach allows you to operate with quiet efficiency, accomplishing more in less time while others are trapped in cycles of motion that leave them tired, stressed, and ultimately ineffective. What unsettles people is that they can see you achieving without the visible chaos they associate with productivity. Your calm, purposeful action contrasts sharply with their frenetic energy, making their effort feel hollow. They notice that their usual tactics, pressure, comparison, or moralizing about hard work, don't influence you because you recognize the difference between substance and show. The truth uncovered is simple but profound. Being busy is easy. Being effective is rare. Your ability to discern the difference quietly exposes the inefficiency and superficiality that most people accept as normal. That realization undermines their assumptions, showing that achievement isn't about constant activity, but about focus, strategic energy, and the ability to act where it actually matters. And once people see that you operate this way, it quietly shakes their sense of control and authority. Number 9. You can sit with uncertainty without panicking. Most people fear the unknown. Decisions are postponed, Emotions spike, and anxiety grows when outcomes are unclear. They cling to certainty like a lifeline, searching for reassurance, rules, or instructions to feel safe. You don't operate that way. You can exist in ambiguity without letting it control you. You assess, observe, and adapt, even when the path forward is unclear, and that ability is quietly destabilizing to those who rely on predictability for comfort and control. When people realized this about you, it created an invisible tension. They expected visible signs of stress, hesitation, or emotional vulnerability when situations were unpredictable. Instead, you remained composed. You didn't demand answers immediately, you didn't force resolution, and you didn't panic when variables were unknown. That lack of urgency is disorienting for those who assume pressure always provokes reaction. Your calm amid uncertainty exposes their overdependence on certainty, revealing just how fragile their sense of control really is. This isn't about avoiding risk or denying stakes. You feel the weight of unknown outcomes. You just don't let it dictate your behavior. You think in possibilities, track potential consequences, and maintain clarity while others scramble for security. That mindset allows you to navigate complexity with precision, taking calculated steps that others often overlook because they are too busy reacting emotionally. What unsettles people most is that your stability under uncertainty highlights their own fragility. They watch as you process, adapt, and continue forward without the frantic need for reassurance, and it quietly undermines their assumptions about influence and predictability. They realize that pressure tactics, emotional manipulation, and urgency lose their effect on someone who doesn't need immediate answers to act decisively. The truth uncovered is sharp and undeniable. While most people are controlled by the fear of the unknown, you operate freely within it. That freedom exposes the limits of those who rely on certainty for confidence, showing that true strength isn't in avoiding ambiguity, it's in thriving within it. And once people see that you can do this effortlessly, it quietly shatters their assumptions about control, influence, and power. Number 10. You don't outsource your thinking to authority. Most people operate on autopilot when someone with a title, reputation, or loud voice gives direction. They accept statements as truth because of the source, not the substance. They hand over judgment to experts, leaders, or popular opinion, assuming that authority equals accuracy. You don't do that. You evaluate information, ideas, and instructions independently. You measure them against logic, evidence, and your own reasoning, and that independence is quietly destabilizing to anyone who relies on obedience as leverage. When people realized this about you, it created subtle unease. They assumed that citing credentials, networks, or history would automatically sway you. They expected compliance or deference to authority. Instead, you challenge assumptions, verify facts, and form conclusions based on your own analysis. Your decisions are informed, deliberate, and unshakable by title alone. That exposes a truth most people avoid. Authority is often arbitrary, performative, and designed to maintain control, not necessarily to guide correctly. This ability doesn't make you rebellious for the sake of it. It makes you rational. You recognize that leaders can be wrong, systems can be flawed, and popular opinion can be manipulated. You take responsibility for your own thinking instead of outsourcing it to someone else's reputation. That self-reliance creates freedom, clarity, and a form of influence that is invisible but powerful. People sense it immediately, even if they can't articulate why it unnerves them. What truly unsettles others is that they cannot predict or control you using traditional hierarchies. They see that accolades, credentials, and pressure have little impact because your allegiance is to logic and truth, not to authority or social expectation. That realization quietly undermines their influence, showing that much of what they consider power is only effective when others surrender their thinking. The truth uncovered is simple but disruptive. When you refuse to outsource your judgment, you expose the fragility of authority. Systems, hierarchies, and influence structures assume compliance, but you operate outside of it. Once this became clear, it shifted the dynamic entirely, leaving those around you uncertain, reactive, and quietly scrambling to regain a sense of control they no longer have over your mind. Number 11. You don't need to be seen to feel real. Most people live their lives through visibility. Likes, attention, acknowledgement, and presence are treated as proof of existence and significance. They define themselves by who notices them, who approves, and who validates their actions. You don't operate that way. Your sense of self isn't tied to recognition, applause, or being observed. You act, think, and exist with authenticity, whether anyone is watching or not, and that independence quietly unsettles everyone who depends on visibility to measure influence. When people realized this about you, it created a subtle panic. They assumed that influence comes from exposure, that control comes from being noticed, and that absence equates to weakness. You broke that pattern. You don't perform to be validated. You don't inflate actions to impress. You operate with the confidence that your value is inherent, not conditional. That makes your presence more formidable and your absence more disarming. People begin to realize that their usual levers, attention, praise, social pressure, lose meaning when applied to someone who doesn't rely on them. This isn't about invisibility or secrecy. It's about autonomy. You can act decisively without an audience, make choices without recognition, and succeed without broadcasting it. That creates a quiet form of power. Others might scramble to be seen, to be heard, or to assert relevance, but you simply exist and operate in alignment with your own standards. That difference exposes the superficiality of social influence and the emptiness of approval-driven behavior. What truly rattles people is that you don't announce your independence. You aren't flashy or defensive. You don't need to prove existence because you already know it. Others feel a kind of invisible pressure, realizing that their assumptions about how influence works, through visibility, performance, or attention, no longer apply to you. The truth uncovered is stark. You operate outside the typical social economy. Your value isn't tied to perception, and your power isn't tied to attention. Once people see that you don't need to be seen to feel real, it quietly destabilizes their understanding of influence, making them question everything they thought they controlled, and leaving them exposed in ways they didn't anticipate. Number 12. You recognize emotional manipulation in real time. Most people fall prey to emotional manipulation without even realizing it. Guilt, flattery, fear, and subtle pressure are deployed so carefully that they bypass conscious thought, shaping decisions before anyone notices. You don't operate that way. You spot the triggers immediately. You see the patterns behind the emotions, the calculated moves designed to provoke reactions, and you refuse to be swept along. That awareness isn't just a skill. It's a quiet form of power that quietly unravels those who depend on manipulation to maintain control. When people realized this about you, panic set in. Not the dramatic, obvious kind, but the subtle, creeping sort. They expected their tactics to provoke compliance, confusion, or emotional reaction. Instead, you respond with clarity. You process the attempt, identify the motive, and act on reality rather than manipulation. That refusal to participate in manufactured emotion removes their leverage. The same methods that work on others, pressure, provocation, and charm, fall flat. It forces manipulators to confront a truth they often avoid. Influence depends on susceptibility, and you are not susceptible. This isn't cynicism, it's precision. You don't react based on fear, obligation, or guilt. You maintain control over your emotional state while others try to steer it. That ability allows you to navigate interactions strategically, rather than being pulled into chaos or conflict. Your perception becomes an invisible barrier, making it almost impossible for others to predict or control your reactions. What unsettles people most is that you don't need to call out manipulation to neutralize it. You don't have to argue, confront, or expose. Your calm awareness alone renders attempts ineffective. That subtle resistance exposes the mechanics behind the manipulation, revealing how much influence is based on invisible levers that are only effective if someone doesn't notice them. The truth uncovered is both simple and profound. When you recognize emotional manipulation in real time, you strip power away from those who rely on it. You operate outside the usual dynamics of control, leaving manipulators frustrated, confused, and quietly scrambling because their most trusted tools are useless against someone who refuses to be moved by anything but reality. Number 13. You don't build identity around opposition. Most people define themselves by who they are against. They measure worth through conflict, comparison, or rivalry, shaping identity around enemies, critics, or opposing groups. Their energy is tied to opposition, and their focus is dictated by the presence of someone or something to push against. You don't operate that way. Your sense of self isn't constructed on contrast or conflict. You aren't energized by proving someone wrong or fighting battles to feel validated. That independence is quietly unsettling to those who rely on opposition to define relevance. When people realized this about you, it created tension they couldn't quite articulate. They expected resistance, defensiveness, or engagement whenever they provoked, criticized, or challenged. Instead, you remained centered. You act according to your values and priorities, not in reaction to attacks or challenges. That refusal to engage in identity-based conflict removes the fuel that many people rely on to feel significance. Without someone to oppose, their narrative of control and influence starts to wobble. This isn't detachment or passivity, it's clarity. You can recognize threats, challenges, or conflicting opinions without letting them dictate your behavior or define your worth. You aren't dependent on conflict to validate your perspective, and you don't seek adversaries to feel alive or important. That approach allows you to operate freely, strategically, and with a level of calm that exposes how reactive others are in comparison. What unsettles people most is that they cannot predict your responses based on provocation. They assume that challenges, criticism, or opposition will draw engagement, but with you, it doesn't. Your independence from opposition shows them that much of their influence is superficial, dependent on the emotional investment of others, and easily neutralized when someone refuses to participate in conflict for identity's sake. The truth uncovered is profound. You define yourself by your own standards, not by who or what stands in your way. That realization quietly destabilizes anyone who assumed that resistance would provoke a predictable reaction. Your identity exists independently, and once that became clear, it exposed the fragility of those who rely on opposition to measure relevance, influence, or power. Number 14. You live as if outcomes matter more than narratives. Most people are obsessed with the story rather than the result. They shape their actions to fit appearances, manage impressions, and control how events are perceived. To them, how things look often outweighs what actually happens. You operate differently. You prioritize outcomes over narrative. You measure reality by results, impact, and truth, not by the drama or perception surrounding it. That perspective is quietly destabilizing to those who rely on appearances to assert influence. When people realized this about you, they began to lose confidence in their usual methods. They assumed that shaping the story, the version of events, the image, the spin, was enough to guide behavior and control perception. You ignore the spin. You track the results, the tangible consequences, and the actual shifts that occur. That makes traditional manipulation ineffective because it relies on belief in the story rather than observation of reality. You act based on what produces change, not what looks impressive, and that approach exposes the emptiness of performative actions. This isn't cynicism or cold calculation, it's effectiveness. You understand that narratives are tools, not truths. You focus on what actually moves the needle, accomplishes the goal, or creates measurable results. That mindset allows you to cut through confusion, deception, and drama in ways that others can't. Where people expend energy on perception, you invest energy in impact. What unsettles people is that your disregard for narrative exposes their dependence on it. They see that efforts to manipulate appearances, control impressions, or dramatize outcomes have little effect on you. Your focus on results highlights the fragility of influence built on story alone, and that realization is quietly terrifying because it undermines everything they thought worked. The truth uncovered is clear and profound. While others obsess over stories, you live by outcomes. You operate in reality, not perception. And that distinction makes you unpredictable, resistant to influence, and quietly powerful. Once people saw that you measure the world by results rather than narrative, it broke the assumptions they relied on, leaving them scrambling to understand how someone could navigate life so effectively without buying into the illusions they depend on. Conclusion. The truth about you is no longer hidden, every point uncovered, the way you resist group conditioning, see incentives instead of stories, recover faster than expected, and refuse to seek validation, paints a picture of someone who operates on a completely different level. You think ahead while others react, detach from outcomes that don't serve you, and refuse to let emotional manipulation dictate your life. You don't define yourself through opposition, visibility, or narrative. You define yourself through clarity, consistency, and results. What this reveals is profound. Your independence isn't just personal. It's destabilizing to systems, people, and expectations that rely on predictability, compliance, and emotional leverage. Where others see chaos, you see patterns. Where others panic, you stay composed. Where others need approval or closure, you move with quiet authority, guided by your own principles and standards. That's why the truth about you unsettles people. It's not loud, it's not performative, it's real, and it cannot be ignored. This isn't a story of rebellion or defiance for show. It's the unveiling of a mind and character operating on a plane that few understand but everyone senses. And that quiet power, the ability to act, think, and live independently, is what separates you from the rest. Those who underestimated you, those who tried to steer or manipulate, are left scrambling because you cannot be reduced to expectation. You are calculated, resilient, discerning, and unstoppable in ways they cannot anticipate. Remember this: your impact isn't in the applause you receive, the battles you fight, or the narratives you challenge. It's in the results you create, the clarity you maintain, and the freedom with which you navigate life. That is the revelation that broke their assumptions, and that defines the unshakable truth about you. If you found this eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment with your thoughts. The conversation doesn't end here. Let's keep uncovering the truths that others can't handle. Stay awakened, chosen ones.